Hello, welcome everyone to our recording of our event, Science in an Election Year, hosted by the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I am Kristen Eulenbrock. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute, and I am thrilled for this event that we put on April 29th in the evening at the museum. We did have a small technical difficulty during the live stream and the recording, so I'm giving you a little bit of an introduction and I'm going to let you jump right into the video and part of the conversation that we had. You didn't miss too much, but we did have a lively conversation at the beginning where we really talked at a high level about some of those big issues in science as they relate to an election year. From there, we started to jump into talking about the lingering impacts of COVID-19, which is where we're going to kick you off here in this recording. I did want to briefly introduce the speakers on the panel so you'll kind of know who we're talking to. We had an amazing lineup, including Laura Helmuth, who is the editor-in-chief of Scientific American. She's had an amazing, illustrious career, including previously worked for the Washington Post, National Geographic, Slate, Smithsonian, and Science. Also on our panel this evening, sitting next to Laura on the stage, is Matt Burgess. Matt is an assistant professor in environmental studies with an appointment in economics at CU Boulder. He's also a fellow at Ceres and the director of the Center for Social and Environmental Futures and a faculty fellow of the Bruce D. Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization. And our third panelist there on the far right-hand side of the screen is Alec Tyson. Tyson is the Associate Director of Research at the Pew Research Center, where he studies public views of science and technology and the implications of science for society. He is a leading expert in both survey research and public opinion, which is quite timely and important for our topic, science in an election year. I also just want to briefly acknowledge and thank we had a couple local partners help bring this together through collaboration and getting the word out. So I want to recognize and thank the Center for Social and Environmental Futures, as well as the Science Writers Association of the Rocky Mountains. Alrighty, sit back and enjoy the recording. If you have any questions or interests, feel free to reach out to us at institute@dmns.org. Enjoy.
One more question, then this will probably start shifting us into ideas and concepts more around trust, engagement, that sort of thing. But I wanted to bring up COVID-19, right? We are still, COVID still exists as part of our lives now, but that was pretty significant during the last election. We've also seen how COVID has impacted trust in scientists and over time. So I'm curious, how are we still seeing the effects? Alec, I want you to start with this for me, from the COVID-19 on this election year, and then we can talk about it quite more broadly as well, too.
Yeah, I'd say it's not a voting issue, right? Not in this election, but its legacy is powerful and multifaceted. One thing it's done, I think it's reinforced existing views on the role and scope of government. We asked Americans, what was your biggest takeaway from the COVID-19 pandemic? Like, what did you learn, right? Really interesting responses, but they were clearly segmenting themselves into two groups based on your political leanings. And for conservatives, the responses we heard is, don't turn to government so quickly. Don't close businesses. Don't close schools. Don't essentially trust government. And for folks who lean more to the left, you heard just the opposite. We need to be earlier to embrace the science. We need to use tools at our disposal to get ahead of these pandemics. And so that's still with us, right? This is a very fresh memory, and it might not be a voting issue, but it's absolutely an issue for governance. What do you want from your government? What do you expect from your government? What are you comfortable from your government?
Yeah, and I think one of the issues in this election specifically is we have a third-party candidate who's running on a conspiracy theory, anti-vax platform, Robert Kennedy Jr., disgracing his family name, and who knows what effect he'll have. His polling is not insignificant, and is he going to take votes from Biden? Is he going to take votes from Trump? It's a little bit early to say, but I don't think his candidate, regardless of his name, I don't think he would be a viable candidate if there weren't enough people who believe in COVID conspiracy theories to sustain him.
So that's a good segue. I want to tell two stories about COVID conspiracy theories. The first one is the one that we probably all heard, that there are people who didn't trust COVID vaccines, and in the first big wave after the vaccine was available, had a 10 times higher death rate than those who took the vaccine. And those are disproportionately Republicans, and we're talking about the deaths of thousands of people. Here's the other story, though, that I think scientific institutions need to reflect on. When the pandemic started, we said that masks don't work because we wanted to hoard the masks for healthcare workers. Then we said that they did work. Then we said that believing that COVID came from a lab was a racist conspiracy theory, and now about half our intelligence agencies think that that's what happened. We said that protesting was bad when it was Republicans in Michigan, and then it was good when it was Black Lives Matter. And so in that context, there were probably a lot of people, average Americans, who are less scientifically literate than we are on this stage, who said, well, I know that they're lying to us about this. What do I believe them? What should I believe them on? And I think some of those people were sucked down into things that in some case got them killed. And so I think it's easy to look down on those people, but what I would say to all of us is they didn't know better and we did. And so it's our job as scientific institutions to be trustworthy if we want to be trusted. And I think there are a lot of hard lessons we should learn from the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, that's also a media story, right? Like if you're getting exclusively right-wing conspiratorial media telling you that you lied, you didn't lie, and passing along these conspiracy theories and telling people not to believe it and not to take the vaccine, that's a failure. That's massive misconduct, I think, on the right-wing media. And I think anybody who's getting local media, trustworthy media, science-informed, health-informed journalism had a much better chance of living through the pandemic because of it. That we'll talk some more about trust, but I think partly they've been misled in a really just terrible way.
Should we talk about trust? I wonder, my tech person slipped off real quick. We have a poll. Could you put our slides back up real quick for us? Thank you, Dave. We have a poll. I'm going to use this poll as a starting point for the conversation, which is where we're heading into, which is about the idea of communication, engagement, both from scientists and scientific institutions. So we have this question here that's in your poll. If you can open that up on Slido. Let me pull it up here. And it's kind of how engaged should a scientist be in politics? And this is politics, not policy. 0 is not engaged at all. And then 5 is pretty highly engaged. And you can use your interpretation of that, but we're seeing 5 as this outspoken activist role. And so I'm getting a lot of responses. So just another few seconds here, get your votes in. I'm going to read them off, and then I want us to kind of have a conversation around it. I think this is a pretty big, robust conversation we're going to have about engagement and who should be engaged and who are these ideas of institutions or individuals who are messengers who talk about these issues. Okay, wow, we've got like 80 some people voting. Okay, so I'm going to generally give you some estimates of where people are because it's pretty clear. Not 0, but a small percentage. We're at like 2% right now at 85, 86. Think scientists should not be engaged at all in politics. 7% rarely engaged. We're looking at about 20% occasionally, 47% frequently, and then 25, 26% is highly engaged. So we're seeing the majority of you all thinking that scientists should be engaged in politics. Thoughts on this as a panel? I think we're going to have some interesting conversation. Laura, do you want to start?
Woo! I agree. I think it's great. So in my profession, at Scientific American, we publish a lot of scientists of all fields, all kinds of scholars, health professionals, graduate students, postdocs, people who are experts in some way. And we encourage them to write commentary, analysis, opinion pieces, and explain how their area of expertise illuminates a policy or politics issue. And from my perspective, I think it's a duty of being a scholar to share what you know and share how what you know is relevant for the biggest questions of our time. I would have voted 4 or 5.
I would vote it depends on how you engage, right? So I think scientists' job is to very clearly distinguish when are we wearing our scientist hat and invoking our expertise, and when are we wearing our citizen hat and invoking our opinion. And to the extent that we're presenting our science, to be as much as we can be honest brokers of what we found and its limitations, and to build institutions that have diversity of views and diversity of ideologies and perspectives and backgrounds, so that we ask different questions. I've done a lot of research in climate in areas that are politicized. So and not always making either side happy. So for example, I had some studies that showed that the hot scenario, the 4.5 degree RCP 8.5 scenario, was unrealistic. And some liberals hated that, and Heartland Institute said I was a brave truth teller. And then I had a study that estimated that climate opinion might have swayed enough independents to cost Trump the 2020 election. And then the Heartland Institute wrote that I was a shill to the Democratic Party and the left. It was actually the same author both times, which I pointed out to but what I found, for example, when I talk to, I've given talks to rooms full of Republicans about climate change. And sometimes I'll get asked questions like, is it the sun, right? Or is it some kind of natural variation? And what I'll say is, look, I told you that we were wrong about the scenarios. I would obviously tell you we were wrong about this, but we're not. Okay? And so I think I worry about institutions. There's a perception that many scientific institutions are captured by the leftmost about 8% of the country, according to some polls. And I worry about that for two reasons. One is just a functional reason. That's a group that often can't win Democratic primaries in places like New York and Minneapolis. And so if the popular support of science ends up approximating that, I worry about what that means for our institutions. But also, if we really think that 8% of the population has all the right opinions, how little do we think of America?
Well, it's a big topic. I'm pausing here because I don't quite know how to start here. But it's a great poll question. We ask a very similar question. And what I can offer is the country is divided on this question. We ask a blunt measure, but do you think that scientists should be engaged in scientific policy questions? A little bit different than the wording of politics. But about half the country says yes. The other half says that scientists should focus on establishing sound scientific research, basically like core research, right? And more or less stay out of policy debates, even if they're about scientific issues. So this question is a really important one. And I love public opinion. I do surveys, but public opinion is only one facet of this debate, right? And it's really a big question for the scientific community and scientists themselves. How do we do this? How do we do this well? When do we do this? Why do we do this? Who speaks for science? And how do we engender broad trust among a wide swath of Americans?
So there's an audience question that ties into it about the idea that this affect public perceptions of bias, right? If scientists, at many institutions are associated as Democrats, right, very much fewer than independents and Republicans, does that create a perception of bias?
Yes. Do you want me to elaborate?
No.
Well, I want to hear Laura's thoughts on this, but I'll say what we saw in our polling is, again, all of this ties to COVID, right, which is one of the most recent high-profile examples of science and scientists in action. And it was amazing how different folks' takeaways were. And one thing we did hear from conservatives was essentially a paraphrase of what we just heard here is a perception that ideology, personal politics was imbued or mixed in with the science. And that's the perception. You can debate the merits of that or when it happened or when it didn't. But we're absolutely hearing that in our surveys from conservatives about what they saw over the past 4 years. And that legacy is very much still with us.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the bifurcation where conservatives are kind of irritated about people, using science applying science to various policy and politics issues. But I think it can serve a purpose of energizing and informing, especially people who are kind of in the middle, like kind of confused, or just want to know. are the vaccines, should I be taking the vaccine or not? And if, when a scientist can speak in an informed way and share their knowledge and their opinion and their analysis, I think it can be very clarifying. And I think that's worth it. And I think certainly some people say, oh, you're just biased, but I think the more that scientists do speak out and share why they know what they know, why they think that they think, that can kind of destigmatize the idea that scientists shouldn't be involved in the human realm.
I think the tragedy of this is that we are biased in some ways we won't admit, but we're not biased in important ways that if we would admit the ways we're biased, then we could tell people and they would believe us about the ways we're not biased. So, one of the stories that you often hear about, why conservatives, and by the way, moderates too, have nosedived their trust in universities since 2015, is that, it's Fox News is mean to us. And they've been mean to us for decades, and yet our trust only started cratering in 2015 when a whole bunch of different measures suggest we became more focused on issues not just of the left, but of the 8% most left. And if you think about, we talk a lot in scientific institutions about diversity and inclusion. Here are three statistics for you. So one is 3% of professors' political donations went to Republicans in 2020. One is about 40% of right-leaning academics report being disciplined or threatened with discipline for their beliefs. And 70% report a hostile climate for beliefs. Well, I have no idea why they don't trust us. It's a big mystery. It must just be that Tucker's mean, right? I think the reason we're not trusted is so obvious. And the tragedy is the vast majority of our science isn't politicized and isn't biased and is really good. And if we just had a little dose of humility about the areas where we are biased and where we are discriminatory, there was a survey of social psychologists faculty that found more than half of them would explicitly state they were willing to discriminate against conservatives in hiring. Right? If we just address these things, I think we'd have a lot more trust in areas where we really deserve to be trusted, like COVID vaccines, which is a life and death issue.
So let me pick up a little bit on some things you both were saying. You brought up the word humility, which I love, right? And you were talking about this idea of clarity and what do we know, what do we don't know, the idea of communicating uncertainty, the idea of being transparent, of getting this greater nuance when we're talking about these science issues. How does that either build up trust or erode it at times? And I would love if you guys had any real world examples to illustrate either side of that.
Yeah, that's something we think about a lot in journalism, especially during the pandemic when things were changing. At first, people didn't know it was spread through the air. It was spreading on cruise ships, and so the fastest disease we understood that spread through cruise ships was norovirus, which does, don't touch your face if you're experiencing norovirus. So we kept learning new things, and with masks, it took a while to understand how important masking was. It took a while to understand that vaccines save your life, but they don't prevent you from passing it on. It took a while to understand that you could be contagious and not have any symptoms. So one of the things that I think health and science journalists got really good at is saying, here's what we know and here's what we don't know. And we actually have a kind of headline formula right now that's, is COVID airborne? Here's what we know so far. And kind of the promise of that headline is, we're telling you the latest information. There's some things we don't know yet, and we will update you. We'll tell you if you know what we don't know, and count on us to come back when we learn more. And so that's a headline that we use a lot. Monkeypox. How is monkeypox spreading? Here's what we know so far. It works really well for public health, but it works for a lot of other things too.
Yeah, one of the challenges with an emergency like COVID is that people panic and it can become hard to find these things out. So for example, what are the trade-offs for education and the economy with long-term lockdowns, and how do those balance with the risk of opening things up for death? We, as far as I understand, our understanding of that changed a lot throughout the pandemic, and we were very quick to shut down people who had concerns, particularly working class people who had concerns about lockdowns. And they gave Ron DeSantis the majority of the Hispanic vote in the last election. Donald Trump, who often has rhetoric that's very racially polarizing, has tripled his support among African American men since 2020, and it doubled his support with African Americans overall. And I suspect some of this has to do with the working class malaise, anger about some of the stuff that went on in COVID, and minimizing some of the concerns that they had. When the economic effects, the educational effects were really devastating for a lot of people, and they mostly weren't the people with laptops writing about it.
Well, what makes me think of, and maybe to take a step back, we're talking about this concept of trust. Well, where do we stand with trust in science or trust in scientists? That's one of the things that we study at Pew Research Center, and it's a two-part story, so you're gonna have to bear with me here, right? So on the one hand, majorities of Americans say they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in scientists to act in the public's best interest. Now, that is down over the past 2, 3, 4 years compared to a pre-pandemic measure. So we've seen a decline in recent years. But in relative terms, science and scientists are still in a great position. We live in a moment where there's low trust in government, there's low trust in journalists, there's low trust in even police officers or public school principals. So the position of science and scientists would really be the envy of so many others. So that's the context for which I think this communication conversation is so important, because it's far easier to lose reputation than regain it. And it's really an inflection point or a pivotal moment for the impression or trust that Americans extend to science and scientists.
And we deserve it, despite what I've been saying for the last 20 minutes. I think that there are some areas where we need to reflect and do better. But I know lots of scientists. We do, I'm an economist, we're not really scientists. They do really good work and absolutely deserve your trust.
I mean, a lot of them do, yeah, but I mean, not all of them. Like, there's in any profession, in journalism, in science, in sports, in anything, there's some goofballs. So
Bad actors, goofballs, bad actors. So what about, there's a good audience question here about the idea, and I'm going to reframe it a little bit, but it's like, how can we encourage elected officials to incorporate more science into some of these political discussions and debates? And I'm going to say, could or should we, right? So kind of that two-part to it. Like, should they be talking about more science issues, or should they? And what role do people have to try to encourage that if they want that?
Yeah, I'd say yes and yes.
Okay.
Absolutely could and should. And I think events like this are really useful for kind of bringing us together to think about the role of science and why it's, is it important? I think, yeah, it's super important. And I think the more that politicians are asked about science subjects, the more they'll have to pay attention. And I think the media plays a big role here in bringing science to the election. It's kind of an opportunity where people are paying attention, and so you can use that attention to inform people about the issues that, like you say, every issue is a science issue at some level. And there's a lot of work, I think, to kind of improve the coverage, especially this year, improve the journalism of covering the election, and try to get away from just the horse race, try to get away from just the both sides and everything, and be a little bit more sophisticated about misinformation, about what we know to be true, what we know to be not true, and to be really straight with readers, with our audiences as journalists about what's actually real and what's not, in a climate of increasing unreality and increasing misinformation.
Let me follow up with her, and then you guys can chime into this question. But you just alluded to that you think there is intentionality here of the media to do less of this horse race coverage. Give me more of the background. Why do you think that is? And where can I see that if that's actually happening? It could be different for Scientific American and others, but I'd be curious if you're thinking about this wholesale as a media landscape, is the media really trying to move away from that?
Not all. I mean, there's certainly the people who came up through political journalism and really love a good horse race. They're not going to go away from that trope. It works for them. It's fine. But I think we can see competing types of stories. And there's an organization that I'm on the advisory board of called Sciline, SCILINE. They do a lot of work training, especially local journalists, in how to cover local science issues and national science issues as well. And you don't have to be an expert in science to be a really good reporter about a subject that has science to it. So they're doing a bunch of trainings, especially about specifically doing a bunch of trainings in the greater Denver area to help local journalists incorporate science into their coverage, and especially their political coverage. So there's a lot of efforts like that, where journalism is kind of looking at itself and saying, okay, how can, in this climate of competing with artificial intelligence, trying to make a business model that works, how can we do a better job?
Well, I'm not going to tell a journalist how to journalism, and I'm not going to tell a pollster how to poll. So focusing on academics, on scholars, I think there's one thing I would say is err on the side of accepting invitations. People want to talk to you, go talk to them. Even if it's somebody who doesn't share your views on something, or something about them makes you uncomfortable. One of my favorite examples of this is Holden Thorpe, who's the editor-in-chief of Science. And he, I'm part of a group of academics that are concerned about partisanship called Heterodox Academy. And we had our annual conference in 2022 here in Denver. And Heterodox Academy members have been quite critical of Dr. Thorpe for what some saw as a very partisan stance at science. And he showed up to our conference to talk about it. And he had been quite critical of us. And so he gets up on the panel, and the moderator asks him, Dr. Thorpe, why did you come? Why did you decide to come to speak with us? And he said, because you invited me. And so I think we need more of that. I thought Dr. Thorpe did a great job in Congress recently, which was another example of an invitation from his group.
I'd just underscore some of the themes you've heard in the past few minutes. We were talking about science communication, maybe in the context of the scientific community, but when and if public officials or elected officials talk science communication, humility, transparency, connecting it to real issues in folks' lives when they feel like they've been given power, being efficacy, that's how science is going to be a successful issue, both for citizens and also to be heard more in government. So it's about, I don't want to say best practices, that almost sounds too simplistic, but it's about doing it well, not just doing it, right?
Okay, I'm going to give maybe one more opening and try to incorporate a couple of quick questions from the audience that we didn't quite cover. But I wanted to ask, in what ways can or should we be making science issues more bipartisan or even nonpartisan?
Maybe I'll start here because I'm going to return to a theme about how much support there is for scientific achievement in this country. Really non-controversial positions are investments, government investments in basic scientific research are worthwhile investments. About 80% of the country thinks that. The notion that the United States should be a leader in scientific achievement, large majorities of all walks of political persuasion feel that way. And I touched previously on the dynamic of trust, which in relative terms is still quite high. So maybe I'll just hand it off to my fellow panelists by saying there is a strong base to build on here and a real public appetite for science and scientific leadership in this country.
That's absolutely right. So in the summer of 2020, a student of mine and I, fairly despondent about polarization, decided to look at, we tried to make what we call the 2/3 majority platform. So if you had to make a presidential platform that was only positions that had 2/3 or more support in major national polls, how much could you do? And the answer is you can do a lot. That there's a lot more agreement than disagreement. Axios did a report recently that did a similar thing around values. And there's a ton of shared values across the spectrum. So I think really leaning into that, and science is, like you said, is a good example. I believe it's the case that climate science funding went up every year under the Trump administration because of Congress, including some Republicans like our Senator Cory Gardner, who understood at the time, how important science is to our economy. And similarly, I believe it also went up under the Bush administration. So just as two examples. So and the fact that we're a leader, and I say we, I'm Canadian, but soon to be we, our leader, when I naturalize, innovation is a core part of this country's identity and really is part of what makes us great.
Yeah, and I think a big part of it is who is science for? And if you feel included in science, if you understand it, if it feels like something that's interesting and inviting, I think that can break a lot of barriers. And I think that's one of the reasons why it makes sense for scientists to talk about their knowledge, talk about their opinion, talk about their experience, and humanizes it. And that can defang some of the, extreme right-wing attempts to, demonize anybody who's intellectual or, can do math in their head or something. There's a lot of kind of anti-intellectual bias that I think is used against science, and it can be used to make it us represent those scientists. They're not us. And so I think science communicative research and scientists who are picking out, it makes it seem like, okay, this is something I can understand. This is, I can feel empowered to be part of a nonpartisan or bipartisan support for science-informed policies or projects.
Okay, let me do one more question. I know we're running just a little bit long and keeping you from your game and food and drink back there. Also, I wanted to open up a poll, which we'll end with as well. It's just going to generate a word cloud. But I kind of like this question. I think it's a fascinating one, and it can go different ways. But someone asked, in a representative democracy, should we be voting on technical issues where there are expert agencies, right, that have the knowledge to make these decisions, right? So distinguishing between perhaps the politicians and the agencies and others who are there informed to make decisions. So I think it's a fascinating question. I'm sure it's like a 10-minute conversation, but I'd be curious if you all have some short thoughts on it.
No. Go ahead.
Look, I'll hand it back to the two of you, but it's a moment where there are murmurs about different types of elective democracy or how our system could work, but goodness, I don't know if there's broad public support or what that would look like. I'm curious to hear other thoughts.
So as much as I do think that expertise is critically important, right? Take doctors, for example. You might get advice from your doctor that you think is bad advice, but you don't want to ever live in a world where you don't have to go to med school to be a doctor and anyone off the street who wants to can cut you up, right? So we have to really deeply respect expertise. That said, the point of democracy, Churchill said, democracy is the worst system besides all the other ones. And I think when you look at through that lens, I think the idea of a benevolent technocrat falls apart in the same way that benevolent dictator falls apart. We are all humans. You give any human concentrated power, and they'll do sometimes nasty things or tyrannical things, even if they're scientifically trained. I mean, look at the stuff that happened, with eugenics, for example. So yes, you should trust our profession, but please don't make us dictators.
Yeah, but I think you can still trust the EPA scientists to understand, environmental impacts better than most voters. And I think that was one of the issues that came up in the Trump administration, is systematically, firing or shrinking, eliminating federal science jobs. And these are nonpartisan jobs. These are career scientists, career government employees who aren't political employees. They just, they have expertise. They study the issues. They give their best knowledge, and sometimes that, flows up ideally to political decisions. But the politicization or the demonization by the Trump administration of federal agency expertise, I think is really dangerous. And it also took $1 billion out of the National Cancer Institute, and we use that. So I think it really is important to have a professional cadre of people who understand the statistics and can do the math, and can understand the research and how it applies, and how it should be applied to all kinds of political decisions. So I think there's definitely a role for federal agencies.
Okay, so for those of you who didn't know, there's another poll question if you want to scan that and go back up to it. But in essence, it's that opening poll question that I stole from the New York Times. Sienna, sorry, Alec, I didn't take one of your polls about what's that one word about your feeling about the upcoming presidential election. So drop your word in there. So maybe I'll leave my panel with this. Do you have one word? And if you don't want to share your word, that's fine. But I would like you to talk about what gives you some hope or optimism moving forward this year. Because again, when we saw A lot of those words had uncertainty nationally. I'm already seeing some really strong words come out here that don't feel really hopeful in my word cloud. So if you want to share your one word about how you're feeling and or give me your bright spot.
Well, people feel strongly about things they care about, right? And if I were to use one word, it would be engagement or engaged. We have an electorate, we have a citizenry that's voter turnout was higher the last election than in any time in recent memory. People feel very strongly about issues they care about right now. It's a healthy thing to deliberate, right? It takes some expressions that can be uncomfortable at times, but my optimistic take on engagement is we're engaged, you know?
I already told you my optimistic take on polarization, which is that the extremes are so good at getting in their own way that eventually that will happen. And I think it's already happening. But let's just zoom out. By almost every measure, this is one of the safest, most prosperous, most rights places to be in the history of the world. If you look at America's biggest flaws, they exist, but they're found everywhere in world history, and they're almost always worse than they are here now. And if you look at America's greatest strengths, they're found almost nowhere in history. So if we want to be good scientists, good journalists, whatever, that's what we should focus on. That's what makes us unique, and we should build on that to solve the problems which are manageable.
Yeah, and of course that experience is very different for different people. But to be, I mean, I think I'm perceiving or hoping to perceive a sense of solidarity and determination that we kind of have to show up and we have to make a difference. And I think more people are feeling like voting really matters more than maybe it used to. Or it's never been an unimportant election, but it does seem like it's a really good deal. And, it seems like more people recognize that, and we've seen that in the off-term elections. Whenever there's been a special election in various states, the turnout has been extraordinarily high, and I think it's really good that will happen this year too. I think that's pretty good.
And just the turnout here tonight, right, to talk about this issue, I think is impressive, and alluding to the fact that people care, are really interested in this topic in this year. I'm going to call out someone who's sitting right here in the front row, a dear friend of ours, Laura Frank, who works for CoLabs, which is an amazing organization here in Colorado, really trying to support local journalism, local media, trying to do a lot of what Laura mentioned, because the media does have a significant role in how we consume media. Keep up the good work, Laura. I know it's hard and tiring. But I also look around and I see many colleagues and people I know who work across the business sector, who work at national labs, work at universities and other nonprofits who are here in the room showing up and engaging. I encourage you to go find someone you don't know tonight and talk to them, and maybe ask some questions and learn something new. Because I've really learned a few things from these folks sitting here to my left and have greatly enjoyed their conversation tonight. I want to call out that whoever wrote the word stressy as their word in this word cloud, that's stress with a Y. Love it. It's a new word for me, but I really like it. Thank you all so much for being here tonight and for joining us. We have food and drink. We'll be here around to network and encourage you to take the time to do so. And thank you to our virtual online audience who joined us, and hopefully they were engaged as well in the Q&A as well. Thank you all. Please join me in welcoming my panel.